All right, so I'm going to finish up our discussion of the brain with a little discourse on plasticity. So our brain is highly adaptable. I think I was starting to make that case in the last segment when I was talking about how much more flexible human behavior is than even chimpanzees, our closest neighbor with the most similar brains. We have a lot more diversity of thought, a lot more diversity of behavior, things like that, because our brain is so adaptable. The word plasticity refers to the brain's ability to reorganize itself. The word plastic literally means shapeable or malleable. So our brain reorganizes itself after localized damage, for example. Here's a case. This little girl's name is Miranda Francisco, and she, at the age of 4, contracted Rasmussen's encephalitis, which is a brain infection that destroys the brain, basically. And so she went from being a gregarious 4-year-old little girl who was talking and walking and potty trained and all the things that you expect out of a 4-year-old little girl to having a really high fever and then progressively more and more and more seizures. Seizures, if you don't know, are where you have, in her case, she was having grand mal seizures, so she was having loss of consciousness, her body would convulse, she'd froth at the mouth, and all sorts of things would happen to her. She'd fall down. She slowly, over the time that she had this infection, she was losing the ability to walk. She couldn't talk. She was not potty trained anymore. It very quickly was becoming pretty grim. And so her parents took her to the world-renowned pediatric neurosurgeon, Ben Carson, back in 1993, I think it was. And he performed a hemispherectomy on her, which is where he removed the cerebral cortex from the left hemisphere of her brain. And he was able to save parts. He basically tried to remove the parts that had been damaged, is what he was trying to remove the infection. So now we have in our image here an MRI of her brain after the surgery, and the black area is where the cerebral spinal fluid has filled back in, where there's missing brain there. When I was in grad school, this case occurred, and I was fascinated by it, and I asked my professor, well, I mean, did they put something in there as a prosthetic? I mean, how does the brain not want to just slosh around inside of her skull now? And he said, well, the dura mater was still in place, and the dura mater is a really sort of, it's like parchment quality. If you've ever felt real parchment that's made out of animal skin, it has that sort of tough but bendable kind of texture to it. And they stitched it back up, and it sealed itself, and then that area fills up with cerebrospinal fluid and causes positive pressure. So now it goes back to moving as a unit, right, within that dura mater. So she didn't have any of the sloshing things that I thought she might have or something. Here's the thing. They had to remove the part of her brain that we know is associated with language, the left hemisphere. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in a second. But they had to remove that left hemisphere, and so they warned the parents. We had to go, it's pretty much the temporal lobe, frontal lobe area, parietal lobe that they had to remove. They did not have to touch the occipital lobe, so luckily she didn't lose vision. But they said, we're going to have to take out that temporal lobe that controls hearing in the right ear. We're going to have to remove the part of the brain that understands language and the part of the brain that produces language. And we're going to be pulling out that motor strip that controls the right side of her body. We're going to pull out the sensory strip that receives information from the right side of her body. She's probably going to be paralyzed, numb, right, unable to speak, and may not be able to understand you, but she'll be alive. And so the parents were like, well, she's going to die, or we at least get to have, one side of her working and she'll be alive. So they went for it. In the recovery room, when she regained consciousness, this girl who hadn't spoken in months because of this illness looked at her mom and said, "Hi, Mommy." And everybody was blown away. They couldn't believe that she could talk. And then they started thinking and reasoning it out, and they realized her plastic brain had transferred language over to the right hemisphere even as she was sick. Even as she was fighting this infection, her brain was trying to adapt and preserve the really important functions. So language had been preserved. I've seen many cases of people who have had hydrocephalus, where they've had water in the brain, where it causes pressure on the cortex. And even though the part of the brain that should have had language in it is damaged, they can still speak. It's really weird how profoundly our brain tries to preserve language. It's like one of the first things that moves. So she was able to speak. She was paralyzed on her right side, and she has never gotten back her hearing in her right ear. That critical period had already passed. But she started physical therapy and slowly got control of the right side of her body again. She has a little weakness, but if you look at this picture of her, you might say, well, yeah, I can see that she's weak on the right side. Wait, that's her left side that she's not holding her arm up correctly. This is just a little girl who doesn't do her ballet very well, right? She's actually got her right arm up very specifically, and maybe she's working really hard to make that happen, and that's why she's forgetting about her left arm. I don't know. But it's just really important for you to know that she's got control over the right side of her body, and that this picture illustrates it. And so it's really remarkable how well she adapted. So we very callously in grad school referred to as the girl with half a brain, and that's not very nice to say, but it's kind of accurate, isn't it? Because they took out so much of that left hemisphere. But what she shows us is if you're young enough and the damage is localized, that means the analogous area on the right hemisphere was fine, those functions can literally move. They now have done scans of her brain, and they see that her motor strip is twice as wide as normal and her sensory strip twice as wide as normal, because it's moved over to the other hemisphere of the brain so that she can still control her body. So those association areas can be really super critical when there's been some kind of damage like this. Probably more relevant to all of us who have not had, a hemispherectomy or something, is that we all walk around with brains that have been shaped by our experiences, right? We'll talk more when we get to perception about the fact that what we have seen with our eyes, like literally seen, throughout our childhood, determines how our visual cortex works. It determines how we make interpretations of information coming in from our eyes. Our experiences shape our actual brain, right? So that each of us have slightly different brains because of that. The way that we use them is different. For one thing, our brains store our memories. So our memories get placed. If it's a memory that's related to sound, you tend to place the memory somewhere around the auditory cortex. If it's a memory related to vision, somewhere in the occipital lobe, something like that. But beyond those sort of rules, the memories are wherever they sort of get placed. And we're all unique in the way that we do that. And so each of our unique experiences has shaped each of our brains to be uniquely different from each other. So we have very plastic brains. So let's talk a little bit about something that I've been hinting at through the last couple of segments, which is the fact that our brains are made up of two hemispheres. Two hemispheres joined by the corpus callosum. So this is that picture that I was showing you earlier when I was introducing the lobes. And I labeled the corpus callosum so that now it's really obvious, so you can see this band of fibers that allows the two hemispheres of the cortex to communicate with each other. The left hemisphere controls language, which I mentioned with Miranda, right? If you have she had her left hemisphere removed, and they thought she'd never have language again. There's actually two different areas of our left hemisphere that are involved in language. In our temporal lobe is the Wernicke's area that allows us to understand language, and then our frontal lobe contains Broca's area that allows us to produce language. We'll get into that a little bit more in another chapter. The left hemisphere also seems to excel at reasoning, drawing conclusions, putting together details, things like that. The right hemisphere has its own special jobs, though. On the underside, again, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse, but on the underside of the right temporal lobe, there's a specific area that is devoted to facial recognition. And if you've ever wondered how come you so often can recognize that you know this person, you've seen them before, and you're like, what is their name? Oh, I'm terrible at names. It's me. I can't do it. It turns out that all of us are terrible at names relative to how awesome we are at recognizing faces, because we have a specific area of our right hemisphere that its job is to figure out, is it a face, right? There was a guy who had a stroke, and it damaged that part of his brain, and he didn't know he'd had a stroke. The only symptom was that he suddenly was talking to parking meters as if they were people and saying, why are you just staring at me blankly like that? I'm asking you a question, right? And the parking meter, of course, is staring blankly because it's a parking meter. This case was written up in a book called The Man Who Mistook His Wife for a Hat by a neurosurgeon named Oliver Sacks. When the guy came in to get diagnosed, Oliver Sacks said, I think you may have had a stroke. And the guy said, I have not had a stroke, and I'm offended that you'd say such a thing. And he goes to his wife, grabs her head, and thinks he's getting his hat off the hat rack, and he's trying to use his wife's head as a hat. He was not recognizing that that was a face. That was not a hat. It's really weird to think that we have a special part of our brain that lets us know that this organization is called a face. Within the faces, this facial recognition area allows us to recognize ones that we've seen before and ones that we haven't, knowing who it is, stuff like that. So a very important part of our brain. The other thing that the right hemisphere specializes in is spatial tasks, like orienting yourself relative to north, or painting, or playing chess. Those kinds of things are the kinds of spatial tasks that the right hemisphere really excels at. So how do we know that one hemisphere does one thing and the other hemisphere does something else? Well, there are some people who have epilepsy that is so intractable. They've tried drugs, they've tried all sorts of other things to reduce the amount of seizures that the person's having, and it doesn't really seem to be working. There's a treatment where they can actually go in and cut the corpus callosum. Now, the picture on the left is a cadaver's brain. This is not what they would do to you in the actual survey. What they've done, or the actual surgery, what they've done in this picture is just sort of peel back the cortex that would be obscuring our view of the corpus callosum so we can see it. Looking down on it like this, you can see why early, I don't know if the word neuroscientist is the right word, because it's, doctors who are trying to figure out what the brain does back in the 1600s and things. When they first were looking at the brain and they saw this corpus callosum, you can see why they thought it was just support structure. Doesn't it look a lot like a tendon or a ligament or something? It doesn't look like it would be a bunch of axons and dendrites, right? So they thought it was just support structure, and they thought that the two hemispheres, they really thought that the left hemisphere was the only one that really mattered, because if you got a blow to the head on the left side, you might lose the ability to speak. If you got a blow to the head on the right side, there's not as big of a dramatic thing that you're going to lose over there. And so they thought, well, the right side's just extra or something. They really didn't understand. But modern tests of what happens when you cut the corpus callosum reveal really big impacts of cutting that corpus callosum, and it really reveals that the left hemisphere has its job and the right hemisphere has its job. So in the surgery, they wouldn't damage the brain like that. They would just sort of pull the two hemispheres apart, cut the corpus callosum, and that's it. And then the person recovers. And then Michael Gazzaniga gets a hold of them. He's a researcher now. I think he's got to be retired by now, but he finished up his career at Harvard studying people who have had split brain surgery. And there's not that many in the country. It's a treatment of last resort. So when a person has the treatment, he does everything he can to study them. Like, can you come here? Can I go there? I need to study you to find out if this is a very common organization of the brain or unique to individuals or whatever. So here we have a pretend brain where the corpus callosum has been severed, been cut, so the two sides of the brain can't communicate with each other within the skull. Now we have the person sitting down and they're looking at a screen and they're told, fixate your eyes on this point that's in the middle of the screen. And then objects are flashed to the right side of the point or to the left side of the point. So the right side where the apple is showing, we'll call that your right visual field. That's if I'm staring at the middle, the things that are to the right of that to that point of fixation would be called the right visual field. The stuff that's to the left of it would be called the left visual field. So through research with split brain patients, one of the things we discovered is that visual fields switch hemispheres of the brain, not eyeballs. For a long time, researchers could not figure out what path the optic nerve took to get back to the back of the brain. You see it there in the middle of the picture where it's labeled the optic chiasm. They knew that it looked like the nerve coming from the right eye ended up on the left side. But when people lose a right eye, for example, they don't lose the ability to see things that are in the right visual field. When people have damage to their left occipital visual cortex, it doesn't cause them to only be blind in their right eye. It causes them to become blind in their right visual field. And so researchers had a really hard time figuring out what was going on. They finally realized if you look closely at that optic chiasm, the nerves from the left side of each eyeball go to the left hemisphere, and the nerves from the right side of each eyeball go to the right hemisphere. So now that we know how it's structured, it makes more sense. Whatever's landing on the left part of the eyeball is actually what's in the right visual field. So the right visual field goes to the left hemisphere. The left visual field goes to the right hemisphere. Okay, now that makes more sense. Visual field switch, not eyeball. All right, so what we've done is a classic Gazzaniga setup here. We're telling you fixate on the point in the middle. We flash a pencil to your left visual field, an apple to your right visual field. So now we say, what did you see? And you, a regular person who has their corpus callosum intact, would say, I saw a pencil and I saw an apple. But a person who has the corpus callosum severed will say, I saw an apple. And when asked, did you see anything else? They'll say, I don't know. I don't know. When they're asked, okay, you didn't see anything else, that's fine. Let's take your left hand, which as I mentioned earlier is controlled by the right hemisphere. Reach behind this screen, so you can't see what you're grabbing, but reach behind the screen and feel the objects that are back there and show me which one you saw. And behind the screen there's an apple, there's a pencil, there's some other things. Without fail, the person pulls out the pencil with their left hand, revealing that their right hemisphere did see the pencil. They just can't say it. So it became very clear that the left hemisphere can talk, the right hemisphere can't. So split brain patients gave us that kind of insight. And for a long time, Gazzaniga kind of thought what the older, hundreds of years ago, doctors had thought. The right hemisphere is just extra, right? It's not as important as the left hemisphere. In more recent research, he's been showing split brain patients pictures of people's faces that have been made out of flowers or out of meat or out of books. The 1300s artist who made them, Archimbaldo, I think it's called. And if he flashes that painting to the right visual field so it lands in the left hemisphere, the person will report that he saw books or that he saw fruit or whatever the face was made out of. If it's flashed to the left visual field and it lands in the right hemisphere, the person will say, I saw a face, which really underscores that the face is recognized by the right hemisphere. So through clever research, clever designs, we've really figured out that the left hemisphere has its special skills and the right hemisphere has its special skills. All right, So our next segment, we will pick up with a new kind of angle on biology, and we'll talk about behavior genetics, and then we'll talk about evolutionary psychology. All right, I'll see you then.